So we're just going to go through whatever questions you guys want to go through, starting with the factoring. So this is your chance to ask. Maybe you don't remember how to do something, you want a refresher, review. Look at all the problems on the first page. The Unit 9 test is just factoring and dividing polynomials. The factoring piece is given different factoring types, can you determine what type of factoring you need to use and then use that correctly. So for this one, you have two terms. There's only two things you can use for two terms. GCF or difference of squares. For difference of squares, neither of these are perfect squares, so that one's out. So GCF, I would need to find what those have in common. In your calculator, if you wanted to find that instead of doing it by the end. You would go into math, go over to number, down to number 9, GCD. And then you can only do this two numbers at a time. So you could type in 28 and 63. Don't worry about the negative because it won't matter. And it'll tell you what that GCF or greatest common divisor is. But that's just number-wise, so you still have to figure out the variable. What variables do they have in common? So if I'm dividing both of these by 7b, this would be 4a squared, the b's would cancel, minus 9. And then you always need to double check, can you do anything else with whatever's left? So again, I have two terms. I need to started to say before the bell interrupted me. You have to look at this and see if you can do anything more with it, GCF or difference of squares. This one does not have a GCF, they don't have anything in common. But these are perfect squares. So you're going to keep bringing down the GCF from the beginning. And then you're going to break this into two factors. And you're thinking, what times what would give you 4? I'm going to give you the answer. What times what will give you a squared? Put that together. And then what times what will give you 9? What would that first term be? You're going to put that first in both. What times what will give you 9? 3. And you put a plus and a minus. It doesn't matter in which one. Yes.
Can't you graph that if you replace the A and X?
So you're not using Desmos on test? So no. Because you have two different variables, you have to change them to X and Y and it wouldn't work out. Now some of these can be graphed, the trinomials with just one variable, but the others not so much. What other factoring questions do we have?
Number 4.
Number 4 is one of your trinomials. Always look for a GCF first. Does it have one? No. So this is a trinomial with a doesn't equal 1. So you're going to multiply the first and the last. And you're going to find two numbers that multiply to be -8 but add to be 7. What are factors of 8?
4 and 2.
4 and 2 and 1 and 8. 4 and 2 wouldn't work, but if I use 1 and 8 and it has to be negative, one of them would have to be negative. I could do -1 and +8. And you're going to split this into 4 terms. Leave the first and last the same. Put the two numbers you found in the middle with the same variable. Doesn't matter which one you put first. And then you're going to factor by grouping. Split the middle. Find the GCF of the first two. What would that be? What do they have in common? One y, or just y. And then if I divide that out, I have 4y minus 1. And then what could I divide out of the last two? 2. So plus 2, leaving 4y minus 1. Then whatever's on the outside, you put that together in a set of parentheses. And then the inside should match, and you just bring down one of those. Now you could put this into your y equals, the original, and put your factors in. You'd have to change all the variables to x, and see if your factors, those two in parentheses, go through the quadratic at the x-axis. And that's how you could check it in the calculator. Questions on that or other questions on factoring? So, 6. So this is a trinomial, but it has two different variables. So let's look for GCF first. What could I divide out of each of these? And in the calculator, if you wanted to do 3 numbers, you have to do the first 2, the last 2, and then if those are the same, whatever that number is, if they're not the same, the GCF of those 2. See? 3xy. If I'm dividing that from each one, I have 8, 1x, 1y, minus 2, no x, 1y, plus 1. Now this, what's left, is not a normal trinomial because the first term isn't squared. So I can't do anything else with this. That is as factored as that would get. What other questions do you
have? Number 7.
Number 7. Okay. Starting with the GCF, what would that be? 4x squared. Because that says 4. And if I divide that out of everything, I have 2x squared minus just x minus 6. And then you have a trinomial where the first term is squared, so then we're going to do the same thing we did before. Multiply the first and the last. And find factors of -12 that would add or subtract to be -1. What are some factors of 12? What would give you 12? 3 and 4. 3 and 4. And that would actually be the two numbers that work. Because I could do -4 and +3. So keep bringing down that GCF. And split the middle into 2 terms. You have 2x squared. I'm going to put plus 3x minus 4x minus 6. Split that down the middle. Find what the first two have in common. What would that be? Just x. Leaving 2x plus 3. And then what would the last two have in common? 2. Negative 2. So whatever this sign is, make sure you bring that down. Negative 2 leaving 2x plus 3. I'm going to write the final answer down here. So the original GCF, we bring that down, and then we have x minus 2 and 2x plus 3. Again, you could put in the original and put in each of those factors, and they should all overlap the quadratic at the x-axis. So far of your factors, we've covered GCF, difference of squares, a doesn't equal 1 trinomials, and grouping within that. The only one we really haven't covered is a equals 1 trinomials, which would be like 10. Do we have questions on 10 before we go back? 10, okay. So if you have just an a equals 1 trinomial, you're looking for two numbers that multiply to be the last, but add to be the middle. What are some factors of 16? And that would actually be the two that work, because I could make which of these negative to get negative 6? 2. Would negative 2 plus 8 give us negative 6? So it would have to be the opposite, negative 8. And with this one, you go straight into your factors. Whatever the variable is, put that first, and then the two numbers you have, make the signs match whatever your numbers are. So k plus 2, k minus 8, that's it. The back are just more problems. Look at that, let me know any questions you have. Before we jump on to the last part of Unit 9, I want you to write these 4 problems down somewhere. Actually, these 6, but we'll start with these 4. Oh, not this. Okay. Somewhere previously in our notes, we did these. Not all of them. We did one. You guys did one. You wrote them down. If you wanted to try others. But somewhere where you have space, maybe on the back, just write these down. So problems like this, your rules still apply. You have 2 terms. So it's either GCF or difference of squares. The first one does not have a GCF, so difference of squares. And same rules, but it's just now in fraction form. So you're thinking, what times what will give you 1? What times what will give you 9? What times what will give you n squared? What would that be? One third, and then 1/5, yes. And then the same thing for the last one, 1/5, and then put a plus, put a minus. Now on the other four, were there any of those we wanted to see you do go over and have questions about? Alright. Okay. So if you see a problem like this, you're trying to get rid of the fractions, and you would do that by taking whatever the last term is, multiplying everything by the denominator of that fraction. So when you do that, everything changes. You could multiply 9 times 2/3 in your calculator or by hand. And the last two would just cancel. And then it becomes a regular A doesn't equal 1 trinomial. So you multiply the first and the last. Find two numbers that would multiply to be 9 but add to be 6. What would that be? 3 times 3. Split this into 4 terms. Split that down the middle. Find the GCF of the first two. What would that be? Leaving 3x plus 1. And then same thing for this one. What would the GCF of the last two be? Just 1. If nothing else, always 1. And then rewrite your final answers. Pretend that says 3. You can either write it out twice or just write it out once. Squared. Either or. All of those would be solved the same way. Look at the dividing polynomials by monomial page. And find any of those we want to see you go over and have questions about. Nine. So with these, you have two different methods you could use. One is factoring the GCF out of the numerator and then going from there, or separating each term and dividing it like that. You can choose. I'll divide for this one. If you do another one, I'll factor out, and then we'll choose for others. So I'm going to rewrite this, each term in the numerator over the denominator separately. And then I'm going to divide each one using my exponent rules. Actually divide the numbers, subtract the exponents. So this would give us 6c squared minus 7c plus 1. It doesn't say factor or do anything else, so that would be your final answer. Questions on that? Other questions on this page?
Number 15.
15, you said. Okay, 15 we'll do by factoring out the GCF. You would do that for the numerator. What is the GCF of these two terms? Five, 1A, 1B, 1C. And then if I were to divide that out, I have 4. You're subtracting, so A to the 6, B squared, C minus 1, all over the 5ABC. If your denominator and the GCF are identical, you just cross those out, whatever's left is your answer. But if your denominator does not match your GCF, you have to divide that separately. So there are some problems like this in that. And then factor that, distribute that back. Your final answer would be 4a to the 6, b squared, c minus 1. Other questions on this page or on the back? By separating or by GCF? Separating. Okay. So if I separate this, 15x to the 5th over 5x to the 4th minus 25x cubed over 5x to the 4th plus 5x squared over 5x to the 4th. This would be a case if you factored, you would get something a little different. So I could divide each term, 3x minus 5. This would give us a negative 1. I'll leave this like this for now. And this would be 1x to the negative 2. And you can't leave your final answers with negative exponents. So 3x minus 5, the x would come down, plus 1 over the x squared would come down. And that would be your final answer. Other monomial questions before we go on to binomial, front or back of this page? Look at the binomial pages. Find any questions you want to go over on that. Number 5. Okay. So with each of these, you have to factor the numerator first. So being good with your factoring methods from before will help you here. Look for a GCF. This one doesn't have one. This is a doesn't equal 1, so we multiply 2 and negative 12. And then find two numbers that would multiply to be 24, negative 24, but add to be 5. What are some factors of 24? Negative 3 and 8. And those would be the ones that actually work. So I will split this into 4 terms. 2x squared minus 3x plus 8x minus 12. Don't forget to include your denominator. Then factor the numerator like normal, split it down the middle. Find the GCF of the first two, which would be what? Close. If you put the 8, then yes, it would be 2x, but because I put the 3 first, minus this x. So that would leave 2x minus 3. And then for the last two, what would those have in common? 4. So plus 4. Leaving 2x minus 3. Rewrite this into your final factors. I'm running out of space, so I'm going to do this underneath this. So I have x plus 4 and 2x minus 3 all over 2x minus 3. And then I cross out any like factors. So the final answer would be x plus 4. You can double check this in your calculator. Type in the original, change the value, the variable to x if it's not already. And then you'll get a line. You'll be able to see where that line crosses the y-axis and then count the slope. You may need to look at the table to count the slope. Do we have any questions on that? Or other binomial questions? Sorry. 5. I think that's what we did. So 4, 6. We have two terms. Would this be GCF or difference of squares? Yes. What is that GCF? 5. So if I divide both of those by 5, I'd have 2x minus 3. And that happens to be my like factor. So my final answer is just 5. Other binomial questions on the front or on the back?
8.
Which one? 8. Does this one have a GCF? No. So it's going to be very similar to number 5. Multiply 3 and negative 6. Find two numbers that multiply to be 18, but add to be negative 7. What are some factors of 18? 92. And those would work if one was negative. Which one would be the negative? 9. So rewrite this into 4 terms. Split that down the middle. Find the GCF of both sides. Of the first two, we have 3y, leaving y minus 3. Of the last two, positive 2. Again, leaving y minus 3. As a general hint, if one of your factors is not the denominator in this, something's off. So your final factors would be 3y plus 2 and y minus 3. What would the final answer be? 3y plus 2. So if you were to put that in the calculator, you have a slope of 3 and a y-intercept of 2. Yes. Yes. I'm going to make sure you come right back. Questions on the back before we jump to Unit 10? 10 on the back. These look different, but it's the same. You could rewrite it. This has two terms. It's not going to be GCF. They don't have anything in common. So difference of squares. What would those two factors be if I'm breaking it into difference of squares? So that would be x plus y and x minus y, leaving x minus 1. That would be something you couldn't do in the calculator because of the two different variables. It wouldn't work. Last minute binomial questions.
Number 9.
So look, this is a trinomial. It doesn't have a GCF. Look for two numbers that multiply to be 33, but that would add to be 8. Add or subtract to be 8. What are factors of 33?
11. Or
11 and 3. One of them will need to be negative. Which one would be the negative? 3. So our two factors would be c plus 11, c minus 3, all over our denominator. And then our final answer would just be c plus 11. Okay. Take a minute or two if you need to go to the bathroom, get a drink of water, stand, stretch before we do Unit 10.